My name is Raven. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, I've been someone people describe with words like steady, quiet, or practical. I live a measured life. I work, I plan, I keep promises. I don't raise my voice. I don't demand attention. And because of that, people often assume I don't see much, especially when it comes to them. I've learned that when you don't express your emotions loudly, others tend to project their own conclusions onto you. They think silence means compliance. They think calm means naivete. They think that if you're not fighting for space, you must not value it. This story begins there. It's about my relatives, people who shared my last name, my holidays, and eventually my inheritance. For years, they believed I was too detached, too trusting, or too distracted to notice what was happening around me. They believed I wouldn't question paperwork, timelines, or quiet decisions made for the family. They believed wrong. I want to be clear about something before I continue. This is not a story about revenge. There are no shouting matches, no dramatic courtroom speeches, no triumphant music swelling at the end. What happened unfolded slowly, methodically, almost gently. The turning points were internal long before they were visible. This is a story about emotional justice, the kind that doesn't need witnesses in the moment to be real. For a long time, I played the role that made everyone else comfortable. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't make things difficult. And in that role, I was overlooked in ways that were small enough to be deniable, but consistent enough to matter. If you've ever been underestimated, not because you lacked intelligence, but because you lacked spectacle, you may recognize the pattern I'm describing. What changed everything wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a confession. It was a single document. One page that didn't raise its voice, didn't accuse anyone, didn't dramatize the truth, yet quietly exposed years of carefully arranged lies. When I found it, I didn't feel anger the way people expect anger to look. I felt clarity, and clarity has weight. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through how I went from being invisible in my own family narrative to becoming the only person who fully understood it. I'll tell you how silence stopped being something that happened to me and became something I chose. And I'll explain why, when the truth finally surfaced, it felt less like victory and more like completion. I'm sharing this because stories like mine often get flattened into cliches, either the powerless victim or the vengeful hero. Real life is quieter than that, and sometimes the most decisive moments happen without an audience at all. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized the truth about a situation long before anyone else was ready to see it? To my relatives, I was easy to define. I was the organized one, the calm one, the one who doesn't need much. At family gatherings, I was the person asked to print documents, book reservations, and keep copies of keys. When something needed handling quietly, it landed in my hands. When something needed celebrating loudly, my role was to step aside and make sure it ran smoothly. No one ever said this out loud, of course. These roles rarely come with formal titles. They're assigned gradually, through repetition, through what people stop asking you and what they start assuming you'll do without being asked. I wasn't ignored in a dramatic way. I was included just enough to be useful. When conversations turned emotional, people spoke over me, not out of malice, but out of habit. When decisions were made, I was informed afterward, usually framed as a courtesy. "We figured you'd be fine with it," they'd say. And I was, at least on the surface. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood how easily concern could be labeled as inconvenience. I learned early that expressing discomfort didn't change outcomes. It only changed how people looked at you. So I adapted. I became precise instead of expressive, observant instead of reactive. I listened more than I spoke, and over time, that quiet presence turned into something else in their eyes: predictability. Predictable people are rarely feared. They're rarely questioned. If someone needed help managing paperwork after my grandmother passed, I was there. If an uncle needed someone to double-check a form, I did it. If a cousin forgot deadlines or misplaced records, I recreated them from memory. I was thanked, genuinely, but briefly. Gratitude doesn't always come with respect. What they didn't notice was that every task gave me context. Every document told a story. Every small favor revealed how things actually worked behind the scenes. But at the time, even I didn't frame it that way. I told myself I was just being helpful. That family dynamics were messy and not worth dissecting. That staying calm kept the peace. That I didn't want conflict anyway. All of that was true, just not complete. The version of me they saw was useful, flexible, and emotionally low maintenance. The version they never questioned was whether I was paying attention. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like exclusion. It feels like being taken for granted. And when you're inside it, it's tempting to believe that this is simply your role in the system, something neutral, even necessary. I didn't feel mistreated. That's important to say. There were no overt insults, no raised voices, no dramatic betrayals, just a consistent pattern of being handled rather than consulted. When inheritance was mentioned, casually, abstractly, I was present, but never central to the conversation. Names were implied, assumptions were made. I noticed how often people spoke around me instead of to me, how easily my silence was interpreted as agreement, and I let it be. Not because I didn't have opinions, but because I understood something they didn't. Once you speak, people adjust. Once you're visible, the environment changes, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Looking back, I realized that my relatives didn't underestimate my intelligence. They underestimated my agency. They believed that because I wasn't assertive, I wasn't decisive. Because I didn't interrupt, I wasn't calculating. Because I didn't demand clarity, I didn't need it. They thought they knew who I was, and in a way, I let them. That version of me, the dependable background presence, made their choices easier. It removed friction. It made plans feel safer, and it created a blind spot they never thought to examine. At the time, I didn't label any of this as strategy. I simply noticed patterns and remembered them. I stored details the way some people store emotions, quietly, without urgency, trusting they'd matter later. I didn't know yet how much it would cost them, but I did know one thing, even then. People who mistake silence for absence rarely notice when it becomes intention. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic enough to deserve a reaction. That's why it stayed with me. It happened during a conversation that, on the surface, had nothing to do with inheritance. We were sitting around the dining table after a holiday meal, the kind where plates linger, and people speak more freely because the formal part of the evening feels finished. Someone mentioned paperwork, estate planning, future logistics, things that were supposedly still far away. I offered a small correction, not an opinion, not a challenge, just a factual clarification about a document I had already seen. One of my relatives laughed softly and said, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that." Not unkindly, not sharply, just dismissively. The conversation moved on without pause. No one noticed the shift except me. In that sentence, casual, almost protective, was an assumption that I was outside the circle of relevance, that concern and involvement were privileges reserved for others, that my role was execution, not consideration. I didn't respond. There was no reason to. Any follow-up would have sounded defensive, and defensiveness would have reframed the moment as emotional rather than structural. I smiled, nodded, and let the topic drift. But something had been cut, cleanly and quietly. Later that night, I replayed it. Not with anger, but with curiosity. I asked myself why that single comment felt heavier than it should have. Why did it linger when so many other remarks had passed without friction? It wasn't what was said, it was what was decided for me. From that point on, I began to notice how often decisions were framed as conclusions before I was present. How often my inclusion came after the fact, presented as information rather than an invitation. How often my silence was interpreted as relief. I noticed the language people used when they thought they were being considerate. "We didn't want to bother you. We figured you had enough going on. You're so easygoing." Each phrase sounded kind. Each one carried the same implication. Your consent is assumed, not required. I didn't push back. I didn't mark the moment publicly, but I archived it mentally, the way you do with things that don't make sense yet but feel important enough to save. After that, the small cuts came more frequently. A document I used to be copied on, suddenly I wasn't. A conversation that stopped when I entered the room. A decision that was explained to me instead of being discussed. None of it was severe enough to confront. All of it was consistent enough to pattern. What made it more complicated was that everyone else seemed genuinely comfortable. No one was whispering. No one was hiding. That was the unsettling part. Whatever was happening felt normalized to them. I began to understand that the system didn't see itself as unfair. It saw itself as efficient. And efficiency rarely asks permission from the quiet. At the time, I still believed the best response was patience. I told myself this was just how families functioned. That being low conflict meant being low priority. That pushing for inclusion would only create tension I didn't want. So I stayed still. But staying still doesn't mean staying unaware. I started to listen differently. I paid attention not just to what was said, but to what was assumed. I noted who was consulted early and who was informed late. I noticed how often my name was used in sentences about responsibility, but rarely in sentences about benefit. I didn't label this as disrespect yet. That word felt too heavy, too intentional. I framed it as oversight, as a habit, as something that could be corrected later. Still, something had shifted internally. That first small cut taught me that invisibility isn't passive. It's reinforced through repetition. And once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. I didn't know then where this awareness would lead. I only knew that I wouldn't forget it. Because moments that are dismissed as insignificant are often the ones that tell the truth earliest. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It simply continues, uninterrupted, until the unusual starts to feel ordinary. I remain the dependable presence, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and filled in gaps without being asked. And in return, I was met with the same gentle exclusions, soft enough to excuse, frequent enough to shape expectations. When inheritance came up again, it was always indirectly, through jokes about who would end up with the headache, through comments about who was better suited to manage certain assets, through assumptions made aloud framed as inevitabilities. I was still in the room, still listening, still being spoken past. What made it easy to accept at first was that no one ever positioned themselves as antagonistic. There were no villains, just people who had quietly agreed on a version of reality where my role was fixed and unchallenged. And I helped maintain that reality. I told myself I didn't need to be included in every discussion. That clarity would come later. That bringing attention to small things would only make me look sensitive. I rationalized their behavior as practical, even protective. They're just trying to keep things simple, I thought. They assume I trust them. They don't realize how it comes across. Each explanation allowed me to stay silent without feeling complicit. But silence, repeated often enough, becomes a signal. The more I accepted being informed instead of consulted, the more that became the default. The more I agreed without question, the more my agreement was pre-written. I noticed how easily people filled in my responses before I spoke. How often someone would say, "Raven won't mind," without checking if I did. How rarely anyone paused to ask what I thought, because they already believed they knew. What unsettled me wasn't the behavior itself. It was how quickly it became background noise. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as an expectation that you will adapt. And I did. I adjusted my emotional range downward. I responded neutrally. I kept my tone even. I avoided moments that could be interpreted as disagreement. Not because I was afraid, but because I was observing. There's a strange safety in being underestimated. When people don't perceive you as a variable, they stop managing your perception. They speak more freely. They leave more trails. I didn't see it that way at the time. I just felt a growing sense of distance. Like I was watching a play I was technically part of, but never cast as a decision maker. Still, I stayed. Part of me believed that patience would eventually be rewarded, that consistency would earn trust, that when the time came, I would be looped in naturally. Another part of me, quieter, more honest, understood something else. If inclusion hasn't happened organically by now, it's probably not coming. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. I began keeping notes, though I didn't call them that. I remembered dates. I remembered who said what and when. I noticed changes in language, in tone, in access. I didn't confront, I didn't accuse, I simply recorded. What I was documenting wasn't wrongdoing, it was a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss than feelings. At the same time, I continued to act exactly as expected. I remained helpful, I remained calm, I remained agreeable. I made no move that would disrupt the image they had of me. In their eyes, nothing was wrong. In mine, everything was becoming clear. I had normalized their behavior just enough to keep myself from reacting prematurely, but not enough to stop noticing it. That balance mattered more than I realized then. Because once you stop expecting respect, you also stop relying on it. And when respect is no longer your currency, you start accumulating something else entirely. Leverage. I didn't call it that yet. I just knew that silence, once chosen consciously, is no longer weakness. It's positioning. And positioning, when done patiently, changes outcomes without ever raising a voice. It took time for me to name the role I had been given, because from the inside it didn't feel imposed. It felt organic, almost earned. I was the reliable one, the person who didn't complicate things, the one who handled details so others could focus on decisions, the one whose presence was useful but whose absence would only be noticed when something went wrong. That role came with a kind of quiet praise. People trusted me with tasks they didn't want to think about. They spoke well of me when I wasn't in the room, usually in terms of competence, not authority. Raven's good with that. She'll take care of it. We don't need to loop her in. She'll understand. Understanding in this context meant acceptance. Once I saw the role clearly, I could also see its limits. Reliability, when overused, becomes containment. You're allowed responsibility, but not power. Execution, but not authorship. I wasn't being excluded because I was untrustworthy. I was being excluded because I was safe. Safe people don't disrupt outcomes. They smooth them. In matters of inheritance, safety is convenient. I watched how roles solidified around me. Certain relatives positioned themselves as decision makers, others as beneficiaries. I was neither. I was infrastructure. And infrastructure is expected to hold weight without being seen. The more I fulfilled that role without resistance, the more invisible it became. I realized that if I ever wanted to step outside it, I wouldn't be challenging a person. I'd be challenging a system that had grown accustomed to my compliance. That understanding changed how I listened. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I stopped expecting transparency. Instead, I focused on comprehension. I asked fewer questions aloud and answered more privately. I noticed how often my help was requested in moments of stress, how rarely my perspective was requested in moments of planning. I noticed that when outcomes were discussed, my presence was optional. But when logistics were needed, it was essential. That imbalance was never addressed because it never caused friction. I didn't resent it. Resentment would have required me to believe the role was assigned maliciously. I didn't think it was. I thought it was efficient, habitual, unexamined, and that made it more dangerous. Because systems built on convenience don't self-correct. They only adjust when forced to. At that point, I still didn't plan to force anything. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was recalibrating my expectations. I accepted that I would not be invited into decision-making spaces. That clarity was oddly freeing. Once I stopped waiting to be included, I could stop measuring my worth by their recognition. I began to act accordingly. I fulfilled requests, but I stopped volunteering extra context. I completed tasks accurately, but without commentary. I maintained my role, but I did so consciously, no longer emotionally invested in how it was perceived. That emotional detachment was subtle, but it mattered. Because when you no longer seek validation from a system, you can study it objectively. I began to see how my assigned role protected others from accountability, how my quiet efficiency absorbed risk, how my presence made certain decisions easier to justify because someone competent was handling the details. I realized that invisibility wasn't an accident, it was a feature. And once I understood that, I stopped trying to escape it. Instead, I learned how to use it. I didn't know yet what that would lead to. I only knew that the role they had given me came with access that they had stopped monitoring. And access, when paired with patience, becomes something far more powerful than recognition. The shift didn't happen during an argument or a revelation. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in a moment so unremarkable that no one but me would ever remember it. I was alone, sorting through a box of old family documents that had been dropped off at my place for temporary safekeeping. That phrase had become common. Things were always temporary when they passed through me, even if they never left. The box smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Inside were folders labeled in different hands, some organized, some clearly rushed. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was doing what I had always done, bringing order to other people's messes. That's when I noticed a date that didn't align. It was small, just a few months off from what I remembered being discussed. I told myself it was probably nothing, a clerical error, a misfiled copy. Still, I paused. Not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because inconsistency disrupts systems. And I had spent years learning to notice systems. I didn't feel alarmed, I felt attentive. I set the document aside and continued sorting, telling myself I'd revisit it later. But something in me had already shifted. A quiet internal click like a door locking from the inside. Up until that point, I had still believed, on some level, that everything would resolve fairly if left alone. That the omissions I experienced were social, not structural. That was when it truly mattered. Transparency would surface. That belief dissolved gently, without resistance. I realized I had been assuming good faith in a system that didn't require it. The change wasn't emotional. It was methodological. I stopped sorting and started reading. Not just scanning, reading. I checked dates against conversations, names against responsibilities. I noticed how often my involvement appeared in margins but never in headers, how my labor was implicit but my authority absent. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even acknowledge the shift to myself fully. I simply adjusted my behavior. From that day on, I stopped taking things at face value. I made copies. I kept timelines. I compared versions. I didn't accuse. I didn't assume intent. I verified. And in doing so, I crossed an invisible line from participant to observer. What struck me most was how little effort it took to remain unnoticed while doing this. No one asked what I was reading. No one checked what I kept. No one wondered why I suddenly wanted digital backups of physical files. They trusted the role I had always played. That trust became the condition that allowed me to see clearly. Emotionally, I felt calm, not detached, grounded. I didn't feel wronged yet. I felt responsible for the truth, whatever it turned out to be. That day didn't reveal the full picture. It didn't even raise certainty. But it changed my orientation. I stopped waiting for explanations and started building understanding. And once you do that, you can't go back to being passive. Not because you're angry, but because you're awake. I remember thinking briefly how strange it was that no one had ever asked me what I thought about any of this. How comfortable they were assuming my silence meant contentment. I didn't correct that assumption. The shift wasn't about them. It was about me deciding that clarity mattered more than comfort. From that moment on, my silence was no longer habitual. It was deliberate, and deliberate silence listens differently. After that afternoon, nothing outwardly changed, and that was the point. I continued to show up the same way. Same tone, same reliability, same willingness to handle what others avoided. If anything, I became easier to overlook because I no longer reacted internally to being overlooked. Silence, when it's no longer reactive, becomes controlled. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped offering context unless it was requested. I answered questions accurately, but minimally. I let assumptions stand when correcting them would have benefited others more than it would have benefited the truth. What surprised me was how quickly people filled in the gaps I left behind. They assumed my quiet meant agreement. They assumed my lack of objection meant approval. They assumed my calm meant ignorance. No one considers the possibility that silence might be strategic unless they've used it that way themselves. I listened more carefully now, not just to what was being said, but to what was being rushed. I noticed which topics were brushed past, which documents were summarized instead of shared, which names appeared repeatedly in conversations about control. I didn't interrupt, I didn't slow them down. That's the mistake people make when they underestimate someone. They believe speed favors them. In reality, speed creates blind spots. I let meetings end without my input. I let plans proceed without my commentary. And in doing so, I gained a clearer picture of how little my presence was considered a variable. I wasn't perceived as someone who might object later. That belief gave me room. Behind the scenes, I began organizing information with intention. I categorized documents. I cross-referenced statements. I saved versions of things that were presented as final, but quietly revised later. I didn't label this as preparation. I labeled it as diligence. That distinction mattered. Diligence sounds harmless. Strategy invites suspicion. No one questioned my diligence. Occasionally, someone would say, "You're so quiet about all this," with a tone that implied reassurance, as if my silence confirmed that everything was under control. I let them believe that. Internally, I felt steadier than I had in years. Not empowered in a dramatic sense, just anchored. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to win. I was making sure that whatever truth existed couldn't disappear through neglect. Silence became a filter. It allowed me to see which relationships were built on convenience and which were built on trust. It showed me who checked in with curiosity and who checked in only when something needed doing. I noticed how rarely anyone asked me how I felt, how often they assumed they already knew. That assumption worked in my favor. Because when people believe they've already accounted for you, they stop accounting for your actions. I didn't correct small misinterpretations. I didn't clarify my stance. I didn't assert my awareness. Each uncorrected assumption widened the gap between who they thought I was and who I had become. That gap wasn't about deception. It was about privacy. I was allowed to have a private understanding of the situation because no one had made room for a public one. And that was fine. What I was building wasn't a case, it was a record. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that if something ever needed to be addressed, it would need to be done with precision, not emotion. Silence gave me that precision. They mistook it for weakness because they had always benefited from it. They had never needed to imagine it turning inward, becoming self-directed. But silence, once chosen, stops serving others by default. It starts serving truth. And that shift, quiet, internal, irreversible, was something they never noticed. What they never noticed was how much access my role gave me. Because I wasn't perceived as a threat, I was trusted with proximity, keys, files, conversations meant to be logistical, not consequential. I was invited into spaces where decisions had already been made, not to challenge them, but to implement them. And implementation reveals more than intention ever does. I began to understand how information moved through the family, not officially, but practically. Who held originals? Who distributed copies? Who summarized instead of sharing? Who spoke with certainty? And who deferred? None of this required intrusion. I didn't need to pry. I was already inside the flow. I refined my habits quietly. I stopped relying on memory alone and started building timelines. Not accusatory ones, neutral ones. Dates, versions, signatures, revisions. I noted when something changed and who was present when it did. I learned how estate processes actually worked, beyond the assumptions people made. I read statutes. I reviewed standard practices. I didn't announce this learning. I didn't ask questions that would signal scrutiny. I learned in private. What surprised me was how often confidence replaced accuracy in conversations. People spoke as if repetition made something true, as if saying it enough times solidified it into fact. Documents told a different story, not a dramatic one, a subtle one. But subtlety accumulates. I noticed inconsistencies that were never acknowledged because no one expected anyone to cross-reference them. I noticed how certain explanations were recycled, even when circumstances changed. I didn't confront these discrepancies. Confrontation invites defense. Defense invites distortion. Instead, I let the record speak to me. Emotionally, this phase was oddly quiet. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of uncovering a conspiracy. Just a steady accumulation of clarity, piece by piece. I wasn't looking for betrayal, I was looking for alignment. And what I found was misalignment. Not necessarily malicious, but undeniable. What they never noticed was that I had stopped needing their version of events to feel secure. I trusted what I could verify. That trust grounded me. They also never noticed how I positioned myself. I didn't withdraw. I didn't distance myself. I remained available, helpful, present. I continued to be the person they turned to when something needed handling discreetly. That continued access mattered. Because positioning isn't about exposure, it's about being where information converges. I made sure I was present during transitions. Moments when responsibilities shifted, when paperwork moved hands, when decisions were finalized quickly to avoid dragging things out. I listened during those moments without interruption. I let people assume I wasn't interested in the implications. I was. I also began to notice what wasn't documented. Verbal assurances, casual agreements, understandings that existed only in conversation. Those absences were as telling as the records themselves. I didn't try to fill those gaps. I noted them. Because absence, when consistent, becomes evidence of assumption. At no point did I feel the urge to expose anything. Exposure requires an audience. I was still determining whether this story needed one. What I was preparing for, though I didn't name it yet, was inevitability. I understood that systems built on assumptions eventually encounter friction. When that happened, facts would matter more than feelings. Records more than recollections. I wanted to be ready, not to accuse, but to respond. They never noticed how patient I became. I wasn't waiting for a moment to strike. I was waiting for the moment when action would be necessary and effective. In the meantime, I learned how little oversight existed when trust went unquestioned. How much power resided in being seen as non-confrontational. They believed they were operating freely. In reality, they were operating unobserved. And that distinction between freedom and invisibility was one they never examined. The reveal didn't arrive with a sense of triumph. There was no rush, no spike of adrenaline, no moment where everything suddenly made sense all at once. It came quietly, the way truth often does when you're not chasing it, when you're simply paying attention long enough for it to surface on its own. I was reviewing documents late one evening, not because I suspected anything new, but because I had learned to revisit things after time had passed. Distance changes what you notice. Context sharpens perception. That's when I saw it. One document, ordinary in appearance, unremarkable in tone, contained a contradiction that couldn't be explained by oversight. It wasn't a missing signature or a clerical error. It was a decision recorded differently in two places, months apart, with no formal amendment connecting them. The implication wasn't emotional. It was structural. Something had been changed without being properly documented. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. Not because I was unsure, but because I was recalibrating my understanding of the situation. Up until that moment, I had still allowed room for benign explanations. Miscommunication, informality, convenience. This didn't fit those categories. Still, I didn't react. I cross-checked. I verified dates. I traced references. I followed the paper trail exactly as it existed, not as it had been described to me. Each step confirmed the same thing. A quiet adjustment had been made, and everyone involved was assuming no one would ever connect the dots. They were right, just not about everyone. What struck me most was how long this information had been accessible. The document wasn't hidden. It wasn't encrypted. It had simply been filed under the assumption that no one would ever read it closely enough to understand its implications. That assumption was my leverage. Not because it gave me power over anyone, but because it gave me clarity about the truth. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. There's a difference. Vindication seeks acknowledgement. Steadiness doesn't need it. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that knowledge changes how people behave. And I needed to see what would happen if nothing changed yet. I wanted to observe the system with full awareness, so I stayed quiet. I continued interacting exactly as before. I let conversations unfold naturally. I watched how people spoke about decisions that, on paper, no longer aligned with reality. I noticed how confidently they referenced outcomes that depended on that undocumented change remaining unexamined. No one suspected that the foundation had shifted. That was the moment I understood something important. The truth didn't need to be announced to be effective. It just needed to be held by the right person at the right time. I didn't frame what I had found as wrongdoing, not internally, not emotionally. I framed it as information that had consequences. And consequences don't require anger to unfold. I also realized that this document didn't just explain the past. It shaped the future. It meant that certain assumptions being made now would not hold up later. Not legally, not procedurally. That understanding brought calm, not urgency. I wasn't racing to expose anything. I was assessing when intervention would be necessary and when silence would allow the truth to reveal itself more cleanly. The leverage wasn't the document itself, it was the timing. I didn't need to threaten. I didn't need to accuse. I simply needed to ensure that when the time came, reality would be unavoidable. That night, I placed the document back where it belonged. I didn't mark it. I didn't move it. I made my own copy and stored it with the rest of the record I had quietly built. Then I slept. Not restlessly, not triumphantly, just deeply. Because once you understand the truth of a situation fully, the anxiety disappears. There's nothing left to speculate about, nothing left to fear. Only decisions remain, and I knew the next phase would require one. Knowing the truth didn't force me to act. It gave me options, and for the first time, those options belonged entirely to me. I laid them out carefully, not as fantasies, but as real paths with real consequences. I could confront them directly. Present the document, demand explanations, force a reckoning. I could walk away entirely, disengage, let the system collapse under its own contradictions. Or I could do nothing, allow time to pass, and see whether the truth ever surfaced on its own. Each option had its appeal, each had its cost. Confrontation would have been the fastest. It also would have been the loudest. It would have turned a structural issue into an emotional one. People would defend themselves, not the truth. The document would become a weapon rather than a record. Walking away would have preserved my peace, but it would have left the narrative intact. The misalignment would remain unchallenged. Silence, in that case, would become consent. Doing nothing was tempting. The truth was already in my hands. That alone felt stabilizing. But passivity, once chosen knowingly, becomes complicity. I understood then that whatever I chose, I would have to live with, not just legally or practically, but internally. The irreversible choice wasn't about punishment or exposure. It was about alignment. I asked myself one question repeatedly. What action allows the truth to stand without me having to defend it? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. I decided to move quietly through formal channels, not to accuse, but to clarify. To ensure that the record reflected reality, to place the document where it would eventually have to be acknowledged, not by individuals, but by systems that don't respond to emotion. This wasn't a move that could be undone. Once initiated, it would proceed on its own timeline. It would require explanations, reconciliations, and responses that could no longer rely on assumptions. I didn't inform my relatives. I didn't hint. I didn't signal a change. I simply began. There was a strange peace in that decision. Not relief, resolve. I wasn't acting against anyone. I was acting in favor of coherence. I understood that once this process was in motion, outcomes would change. Expectations would shift. Certain narratives would no longer hold. That was the irreversible part. Not that people would be confronted, but that the truth would no longer depend on anyone's agreement. I took my time initiating the steps. I made sure everything I submitted was accurate, complete, and unemotional. I resisted the urge to explain myself preemptively. Systems don't need explanations. They need information. And the information I had. Throughout this period, my behavior toward my relatives didn't change. I remained calm, present, reliable. I didn't withdraw affection or cooperation. I didn't distance myself emotionally. That consistency was important. It ensured that no one could later claim provocation or hostility. When the consequences arrived, and I knew they would arrive cleanly. I also accepted something quietly during this time. Once truth enters a system built on assumption, relationships change. Not always permanently, but irreversibly. I was prepared for that. I wasn't choosing isolation, I was choosing integrity. And integrity, once acted upon, doesn't ask for permission. The decision point didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a closing of one chapter and the opening of another. Less visible, more consequential. I didn't announce it. I let it move. Once the decision was made, the rest became execution. Quiet, sequential, unremarkable on the surface. This was the part no one ever imagines when they think about justice. The waiting rooms, the neutral language, the absence of drama. There were no confrontations, no warnings, no symbolic gestures, just forms, confirmations, timestamps. I moved through systems that didn't know my family, didn't care about intention, and didn't respond to sentiment. That was their strength. They asked for consistency, not explanation. I submitted documents exactly as they were. I requested clarifications without commentary. I corrected records without attaching stories to them. Everything I did could stand on its own without me present in the room. That was deliberate. If someone later questioned why I had acted, the answer would be simple: because the record required it. No one noticed the shift because nothing in my outward behavior changed. I still answered messages. I still showed up when needed. I still fulfilled my role. And because I had never been seen as someone who might act independently, no one imagined I was doing so now. That assumption created a buffer of time. I used it carefully. I double-checked every submission. I verified receipt. I followed up only when necessary. I avoided urgency. Urgency invites attention. I wanted inevitability. There's a difference. I understood that once processes were underway, they would intersect with my relatives' plans eventually, but not immediately. And when they did, it wouldn't feel like confrontation. It would feel like an interruption. Interruptions are harder to argue with than accusations. During this period, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief without excitement. I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I trusted the process because I had respected it. That trust allowed me to remain emotionally neutral. I didn't fantasize about outcomes. I didn't anticipate apologies or panic. I didn't imagine vindication. I simply continued living my life alongside this quiet movement unfolding beneath the surface. What struck me most was how easily people continued to speak with certainty. They referenced future distributions. They made casual comments about how things would work out. They joked about logistics that were no longer aligned with reality. I listened without correcting them, not because I wanted them to be wrong, but because correction wasn't my role anymore. The system would do that. At one point, someone asked me, almost offhandedly, if I'd noticed anything odd in the paperwork lately. The question was framed lightly, without suspicion. I answered honestly and minimally, nothing inconsistent with the documents themselves. It was true. and it said more than they realized. That moment confirmed something important. People sense disruption before they understand it. They feel friction before they identify its source. I stayed calm. Silence at this stage wasn't concealment, it was respect for timing. I knew that once the consequences began, explanations would be demanded. Not from me, but from those who had benefited from the assumption. I wasn't interested in narrating the truth. I wanted it to surface naturally. And it would. Systems don't rush. They accumulate pressure quietly and release it without warning. That's what was happening now. I moved in silence, not because I was hiding, but because there was nothing left to say. The first signs weren't dramatic, no alarms, no sudden reversals, just confusion, a delay where there hadn't been one before, a request for clarification that couldn't be answered quickly, a plan that needed a bit more time without a clear explanation. I noticed the shift before anyone said it out loud. The tone changed first. Conversations grew more cautious, less certain. Statements that used to be made confidently were now framed as possibilities. People began checking details they had never questioned. That's how you know something real has begun. At first, the discomfort was subtle enough to dismiss. Someone joked about bureaucracy being slow. Someone else complained about unnecessary complications. The narrative initially was inconvenience, not consequence. I listened. What they didn't realize was that the inconvenience wasn't random. It was the system encountering information it hadn't accounted for. As weeks passed, the questions became more specific. Who had signed off on what? When certain decisions were finalized, why didn't they align the way they were expected to? Those questions didn't come to me. Not yet. That too was telling. I remained in my role, helpful, neutral, unassuming. I answered what I was asked. I didn't volunteer context. I didn't speculate. I let the process unfold. Inside, I felt steady, not detached, present. There was no satisfaction in watching others feel uncertain, just confirmation that truth, once introduced, does its work quietly. The first real consequence arrived disguised as a minor adjustment. A distribution timeline shifted, a responsibility was reassigned, a temporary hold was placed where none had existed before. That was enough to unsettle them. I watched how quickly confidence evaporated when assumptions were challenged, how often people turned to each other for reassurance instead of facts. No one accused anyone yet. Confusion came before blame. And confusion is uncomfortable because it offers no clear target. At some point, someone remarked that things were starting to feel off. The phrase lingered in the room longer than intended. It wasn't fear yet, but it wasn't calm either. Still, no one looked at me. That invisibility held. I was struck by how rarely people consider that systems respond to reality, not intent, that even well-meaning decisions collapse when they aren't supported by documentation. The consequences weren't punitive, they were corrective. And correction always feels like a loss to those who expected continuity. I noticed how people began retracing steps, searching for the moment things had gone wrong. They reviewed conversations, they reinterpreted past decisions, they speculated quietly. What they didn't do was revisit their assumptions about me. That was the final blind spot. The loss they were beginning to feel wasn't material yet, it was psychological. The loss of certainty, of narrative control, of the belief that things were settled. That kind of loss is destabilizing because it can't be negotiated away. I stayed calm. I stayed kind. I stayed present. There was no need to shift my demeanor. Any change would have drawn attention. Consistency at this stage was my strongest ally. As the consequences continued to surface, I felt no urge to step in and explain. The system wasn't confused. People were. And people, when confused, reveal more than they intend. I paid attention. By the time panic appeared, the window for quiet correction had already closed. It didn't arrive all at once. Panic rarely does. It leaked in through tone shifts, urgent messages, and meetings called just to clarify a few things. What had once been casual became careful. What had once been assumed became questioned. And still no one fully understood why. I watched as my relatives moved through the stages people always go through when certainty disappears. First, denial. They reassured each other that delays were normal, that paperwork always took time, that nothing fundamental had changed. Then irritation, complaints about inefficiency, about people making things more complicated than necessary. Eventually, that irritation turned inward. Questions were asked more sharply now. Who handled what? Who knew which details? Who had last seen which documents? Conversations that used to be light now carried tension beneath the surface. They were trying to locate the problem without accepting that the problem wasn't a person, it was a record. At one point, someone suggested that a mistake must have been made somewhere along the way. The phrasing mattered, somewhere vague, somewhere impersonal, somewhere that didn't implicate any decisions already made. They were still trying to fix it socially. But systems don't respond to social repair. They respond to accuracy. As the process continued, the tone shifted again, from frustration to concern. People began speaking more quietly, more cautiously. There were fewer jokes, fewer assumptions stated aloud. Plans were now framed as contingencies. I was present for many of these conversations, still calm, still composed, still treated as infrastructure rather than influence. That role protected me, because when people feel threatened, they look for variables. And I was never considered one. The realization that something was truly wrong arrived not through confrontation, but through limitation. Certain options were no longer available. Certain outcomes were no longer possible. That's when regret surfaced, not for actions taken, but for assumptions made. I could see it in how people replayed past moments, searching for reassurance that they hadn't missed something obvious. I heard it in how often my name was mentioned in hindsight, usually in phrases like, "Raven probably would have known," or "Raven was always good with the details." Those comments came too late to change anything, because knowledge isn't power unless it's acknowledged before decisions are finalized. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold, just a quiet confirmation that timing matters more than intention. That correction, once delayed too long, becomes impossible. There were moments when I sensed the urge to ask myself directly, to finally step outside the assumptions and question what I knew. But those moments passed. Pride, habit, and fear of what the answer might reveal kept them silent. By the time they understood that nothing could be reversed, the truth had already settled into place. Not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. They didn't know yet what the outcome would be, only that it wouldn't be what they had planned. And that uncertainty was something they had never prepared for. I remained steady. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer an explanation. I simply continued to be present without inserting myself into the narrative. That restraint mattered, because when the truth finally surfaced, and it wouldn't be framed as something I did to them. It would be framed as something they had built without me, and that distinction made all the difference. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It happened in a quiet room with neutral language and careful pauses. No one raised their voice. No one accused outright. The tension wasn't explosive. It was restrained, the kind that comes from realizing something irreversible has already occurred. They asked me what I knew. Not aggressively, not defensively, almost cautiously. I answered honestly. I told them I had noticed inconsistencies and had followed the records where they led. I didn't present myself as a whistleblower or a victim. I didn't recount every moment of dismissal or every assumption that had made this possible. I spoke only about facts. I explained that I hadn't acted emotionally and I hadn't acted secretly. I had acted formally, through channels designed for accuracy, not consensus. There was a pause after that, a long one. I could see the recalibration happening in real time, the moment when someone realizes that their understanding of another person has been incomplete, that the quiet presence they had categorized as passive had been observing all along. Someone asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I didn't answer immediately, not to dramatize the moment, but because the answer required care. I didn't think it would have mattered, I said finally. At the time, decisions were already framed as settled. That was true. And it landed without accusation. There were no denials, no justifications offered aloud, just silence, followed by a subtle shift in posture, shoulders tightening, eyes lowering. They understood then that this wasn't about being caught. It was about being seen clearly for the first time. I wasn't angry. That surprised them. Anger would have been easier to respond to. Anger invites defense. Calm invites reflection. I told them I hadn't intended to embarrass anyone. I hadn't shared what I found with anyone else. I had simply ensured the record reflected reality. That distinction mattered. The room stayed quiet, not tense, still. Eventually, someone said, "We didn't think you were paying attention." I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I said, I just didn't interrupt. There was nothing more to say after that. No demands, no ultimatums, no emotional closure. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with understanding. They knew they couldn't undo what had happened, and they knew finally that I wasn't the person they had assumed me to be. I left the room feeling lighter, not because I had been validated, but because I had remained aligned with myself throughout. The truth didn't need volume, it had held. After everything settled, after the process is completed, the outcomes clarified, and the conversations ended, I noticed something unexpected. I didn't feel changed. At least, not in the way people imagine change after conflict. I wasn't hardened. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't emotionally distant. I was clearer. The version of myself that emerged wasn't new. It was simply no longer compressed by other people's expectations. For years, I had been defined by utility, by how easily I made things for others, by how little space I took up while doing important work. That identity wasn't false, but it was incomplete. Now it no longer felt necessary to perform it. I didn't announce a shift. I didn't redefine myself publicly. But in quiet ways, I stopped accepting roles that required invisibility as a prerequisite. I noticed how differently I moved through conversations. I spoke when something mattered to me, not to correct, not to assert dominance, but to participate fully. And when I didn't speak, it was because I chose not to, not because I was waiting for permission. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. Some relationships adjusted. A few grew distant, not out of conflict, but out of recalibration. When people can no longer rely on your silence to smooth their decisions, they have to engage with you differently, or step away. I accepted that without resentment. I also realized the need to be understood by everyone involved. Understanding, I learned, is not a prerequisite for peace. Alignment is. I didn't carry bitterness forward. Bitterness would have required me to keep reliving moments that no longer defined me. Instead, I kept the lessons. I learned that quiet people are often mistaken for simple people, that emotional restraint is frequently confused with emotional absence, and that being underestimated is only dangerous if you internalize it. I didn't. What mattered most to me was that I had acted without cruelty. I hadn't embarrassed anyone publicly. I hadn't sought to punish or humiliate. I had allowed the truth to correct the system without adding noise to it. That mattered. Because the person I wanted to remain was someone who could act decisively without becoming reactive. I still value calm. I still value discretion, but I no longer confuse them with compliance. There's a difference between being peaceful and being passive. Now, when I look back at who I was to them, I don't feel regret. I feel understanding. I see how the role formed, how it persisted, and how it eventually dissolved, not through confrontation, but through clarity. I don't need to prove anything now. The system corrected itself. The truth stood without my constant involvement. And I stepped forward, not louder, not harsher, but more whole. That's who I am now. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a final judgment, to decide who was right, who was wrong, who deserved what. I understand that instinct. It gives shape to discomfort. It turns complexity into something easier to hold. But real life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What this experience taught me isn't that silence always wins, or that patience is inherently virtuous, or that systems are always fair. It taught me something quieter and more enduring. Truth doesn't need force when it's supported by clarity. For a long time, I believed that being calm meant staying out of the way. That preserving peace required minimizing myself. That if something mattered, someone louder or more visible would eventually handle it. That belief kept me useful, but it also kept me invisible. The shift came when I realized that integrity doesn't announce itself. It acts, often slowly, often without witnesses, and often in ways that don't feel dramatic in the moment, but reshape outcomes permanently. I didn't win because I outplayed anyone. I didn't prevail because I was smarter or more deserving. I simply paid attention longer than others expected me to, and I respected the truth enough to let it move through proper channels instead of emotional ones. That's not a tactic, it's a posture. There's also something important I want to name. Not every quiet person is strategic, and not every loud person is careless. But when people assume they already understand you, they stop listening. And when they stop listening, they stop noticing. That's where the imbalance begins. If you take anything from this story, I hope it's this. You don't have to perform outrage to honor yourself. You don't have to expose everything publicly to correct what's wrong. And you don't owe your silence to anyone who mistakes it for consent. At the same time, silence alone isn't a virtue. It only becomes meaningful when it's chosen consciously and paired with responsibility. What happened in my family didn't end with applause or closure scenes. It ended with a recalibration, a new understanding of who I was and who I would no longer allow myself to be perceived as by default. That was enough. I don't tell this story to encourage suspicion or quiet retaliation. I tell it because many people live inside systems where their calm is misread, their competence is taken for granted, and their presence is underestimated. If that's you, I want you to know something. Paying attention is not passivity, and clarity, once built, doesn't disappear, even if you never raise your voice. I'll leave you with one question, not rhetorical, not performative, just honest. Have you ever realized that staying quiet wasn't the same as staying powerless? And if so, what changed for you? Thank you for listening.